Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wistran, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of geopolitical shifts and new alliances in Eurasia. This event is co-sponsored by the Kennan Institute and the South Asia Institute, which is a part of the Indo-Pacific program. Today's guests are Dr. Marcia McGraw-Olive, Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, Michael Kugelman, and Rahula Usmani. Dr. Marcia McGraw-Olive is a Wilson Center Global Fellow and an adjunct lecturer of European and Eurasian Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's also a former George F. Kennan Fellow with the Kennan Institute. Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick is a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses and senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. Additionally, she's a former public policy scholar with the Indo-Pacific program. Michael Kugelman is the director of the South Asia Institute. He's an expert on U.S. relations with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and he writes a weekly column about South Asia for Foreign Policy magazine. Finally, Rahula Usmani is a global fellow with the South Asia Institute and the Kennan Institute. His areas of expertise include governance and economic development. He's previously worked with a wide array of organizations such as USAID and the World Bank. So after our guests speak, we're going to do about a 35-minute discussion amongst the four of them. After they speak, there's going to be a question and answer period. So for our audience members, you may submit questions in one of two ways. You can either send an email to the Kennan Institute account, and that is kennan@wilsoncenter.org, or on your Zoom screen via the Q&A function at the bottom, you can submit a question that means. And please remember when you submit your questions to include your name and affiliation. And again, the first 35 minutes, it's going to be a discussion amongst our guests, but you can feel free to submit your questions at any point. And just one final reminder, today's discussion is being recorded. And so with that, I want to turn my first question to Marcia, or my first questions actually to you, Marcia. I'm wondering if you could speak about how Russia's war against Ukraine has reshaped geopolitical alliances in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And building on that, my secondary question to that is, how has the U.S. responded to these changes?
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate today. And let me start with a brief answer to your two questions. The invasion and other shocks have scrambled the geopolitical Rubik's Cube in Eurasia. Countries in the Caucasus, that's Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, are flexing their sovereign muscles in new ways. The first C5+1 summit with Central Asian leaders by President Biden was an historic achievement. But otherwise, the United States, I believe, has failed to articulate a new strategy or facilitate investments to demonstrate that the region, for its own sake, is vital to U.S. security. I think it's fair to ask if we are on the cusp of a critical juncture. Could the disruption of traditional trade patterns and alliances give birth to new institutions that will endure, reduce the risk of destabilization in this broader Eurasian region, and provide alternatives to Russian hegemony or to Chinese economic coercion in the future? I have in mind examples like a regional energy market, electricity market, or transit union tied to the middle corridor across the Caspian. As I will argue, unless regional actors and partners work hard at the political level to institutionalize the dynamic changes underway, Russian imperial dominance, while weakened, will continue. And I would leave the question on China to Elizabeth's expertise. But let me go back on why it's even possible to talk about a critical juncture at this moment. The region has experienced three shocks. The first in 2020 was when China's very radical reaction to COVID-19 shut down supply chains and made it harder for the Central Asians to handle their own food and energy security. So they began to focus on that anew in new ways. In 2021, the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan undermined U.S. credibility and increased the importance of the region as a buffer for radical Islam. And then in 2022, as you mentioned, the Russian invasion itself. This increased fear of the unpredictability of Russian foreign policy in the broader region. And in a major break from the past, none of the countries supported Russia in UN condemnations of its invasion, or none of them had recognized the annexations of Ukrainian regions. But I think more critically for our discussion today, the invasion also boosted the attractiveness of the Caucasus and Central Asia as an alternative to Russia for transit, energy, and minerals, for example. And as a result, it has stimulated competition for resources and strategic real estate across the entire Eurasian land bridge. With competition has come institutional innovations at the bilateral and multilateral level, and among the Central Asians and Caucasus countries, very pragmatic rebalancing of their relations. Now, just give me a few examples of that. Within Central Asia, the C5 presidential summits have evolved and strengthened, including a rare draft security treaty that was adopted 5 months after the invasion. And the participation of Azerbaijan has effectively turned the C5 into the C6. We're also seeing a roadshow of C5+1 summits. That means the Central Asia 5, that's excluding Afghanistan, of course, with other nations to demonstrate that at the presidential level, not just at the foreign ministry level, that these countries merit more attention. The first was by Putin in October 2022. He prefers bilateral dealings or running it under the context of Moscow-led organizations. But this was an important summit for him. It was followed in May 2023 by Chinese President Xi. Elizabeth might want to say more about that. And this externally, though, these external summits have turned into this roadshow that has then led to Biden in 2023 after Xi. But not to be outdone, if I could just list the numbers of countries that have had these C5+1, it's been Turkey, India, Germany, the EU, Gulf Cooperation Council, Organization of Turkic States, and Japan. And next year we will see South Korea. Now, with this geopolitical change is coming a change in geoeconomics. Significant diversification and increase in divestment in Central Asia, including and notably from the Middle East. China has overtaken Russia as the main trading partner in 2023, and Europe is significantly up in its engagement. Within the region, trade is expanding greatly, and trade volumes from China to Europe across Central Asia have quadrupled. This is very good for regional economic development. Now, I should also add that there's been quite a lot of re-export of some sensitive goods from Europe and China through Central Asia and the Caucasus to Russia. Now, what's the U.S. response been? As I mentioned, historic achievement in the summit. They've had a great joint declaration that increased security ties, educational assistance, a dialogue on strategic critical minerals, methane reduction pledge, and I think the B5+1 to strengthen the process of businesses. All of this has been very positive. They've also tried to push more for this middle corridor across the Caspian, which is a very high stakes priority to reduce reliance on trade and transit through Russia. But in other ways, as I mentioned, they have fallen short. And I think in particularly, they have been pressing on secondary sanctions, which the EU has not done. They failed to provide additional financing through mechanisms like the Development Finance Corporation or the G7's alternative to BRICS. And they have not done anything to really update the Trump very outdated strategy, which was based on Afghanistan. Now, meanwhile, Russia may be down, but it's not out. Notwithstanding sanctions, 40% of the world's economies do actively trade with Russia, and we saw that at the BRICS summit in Kazan. It's still the dominant security provider to Central Asia and has recently extended the nuclear umbrella to CSTO countries. Putin is not giving up on the Caucasus, despite the Armenian suspension of its participation in the CSTO. And on energy, oh, and I have to mention one more thing on the Caucasus, is that Putin recently praised Georgia's leadership after a very tainted election for suspending its EU accession talks. On energy, I was about to say Putin is angling for a gas union with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and it's hoping to build a nuclear reactor in Kazakhstan. Finally, it's pressing for ways to ensure that it can dominate trade routes when the Ukraine war ends, and one of these routes could potentially go through Iran to the Chabahar port, where India has just planted a flag with a major investment. So all this leaves an opportunity for the incoming Trump administration to upgrade the region as a long-term focus of U.S. foreign policy in the national interest of the United States. Aside from the institutional innovations I mentioned, I think we should be investing much more in education and training, technology, and particularly critical minerals, given the recent threat to halt the trade in critical minerals from China to the United States. So I'll stop there.
That was phenomenal, Marcia. And I have so many questions I myself wrote down, but I'm going to save them for the question and answer at the end. And I'm going to move with that to Elizabeth, since Marcia said you should save her Chinese perspective for Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, main question I have for you, and I also have a follow-on for you as well. How is China's Belt and Road Initiative impacting Central Asia's economy from both a regional and a global perspective? And then building on that, is China's approach to Central Asia similar to its approach to South Asia, or do you think it's comparatively different?
Thank you, Jennifer, for these great questions. It's my pleasure to be on this panel and discuss these issues. So if we look at China's approach to Central Asia, going back to the 1980s, China has been trying to strategize about regional integration with this region for some decades. But it's mostly been about how Central Asia can contribute to China's Western development, rather than the other way around. Typically, China doesn't want strong regions. If you look at how China acts in other parts of the world, it's much easier for China to interact with smaller countries individually rather than to have some strong regional institutions or interactions going on there. So what about the BRI? So the Belt and Road Initiative, it was announced in Kazakhstan, and so its land focus is very much connected to Central Asia as a transit space. But this is a China-centric strategy. It's a geopolitical strategy. And it's also a domestic economic strategy that brings employment to China's state-owned enterprises, and it helps China export its goods and find new markets. If you look at Central Asia as a transit space, this has not been an easy goal to achieve. And the railroad that we are now seeing possibly being constructed, connecting China to Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, has been discussed since the 90s. So it's certainly not an easy area to work in. And part of it is because it's just so diverse. You don't have a Central Asian economy. You have 5 economies. And they're all very different. Each of the 5 countries has very different resource characteristics. And as Marcia mentioned, China's trade in the region is now surpassing Russia's. But some of this is also re-exports to Russia, and especially a material that supports the war in Ukraine. So regrettably, some Central Asian countries have been serving in this intermediary function, partly because of Russian businesses that are located there that facilitate this. The countries of Central Asia are also integrated with Russia to varying degrees. And Russia, as Marcia said again, is determined to keep this influence and even increase it. And so it becomes a very constraining neighborhood. And so the countries are looking to get outside of the neighborhood to engage with multiple partners. I just came back from Kazakhstan a couple of months ago, and there's a real interest in Turkey, in the EU, in the US, if we would only be more active, as Marcia said, with East Asia, India. So there's a real desire to move out of this neighborhood and to engage with more partners in many of the countries. This being said, the five countries are connected to China. They do depend on Chinese supply chains for many things, and they have different degrees of indebtedness. The poorer countries have higher levels. Kyrgyzstan, for example, its indebtedness to China is 27% of GDP. Tajikistan also has a high level of debt. But Kazakhstan, the larger, more wealthy economy, is in a better position, owing only 3.5% of GDP to Beijing, but still having hidden debt. So this is the debt that its state-owned enterprises have to Chinese enterprises that are not figured into the overall debt figures. And Aid Data has done some fantastic work on this issue. So the different levels of dependence on China, and China has different degrees of interest in particular countries, with the ones neighboring on Xinjiang being the most significant for China because of its concern with domestic stability and the potential for spillover of any tensions into Xinjiang. The resource sector is of primary importance to China in Central Asia. And fossil fuels remain very important despite China's pledges to have a green BRI. You still, like in Kazakhstan, you still see about half of the investments are fossil fuel related. The security sector is becoming more important, especially in Kyrgyzstan and in Tajikistan, where China actually has border forces stationed in connection with concerns over Afghanistan. The digital Silk Road is being constructed to connect these countries to China's information space. This is an issue that concerns some in Central Asia in terms of who controls the data in this kind of connection. And not surprisingly, there are many different perceptions of China in these countries. There was recently a Central Asian Barometer survey using 2023 data that was released, and it's so rich and interesting and confusing because you see some positives in terms of Central Asians appreciating certain kinds of investments while fearing others, especially in land. Or issues with Chinese employment practices and so on. And so it's really hard to characterize the opinion of China because it's complicated in terms of the people you speak to, the sector you're talking about. But I think generally China is viewed, at least this was my impression in Kazakhstan, as kind of an unknown. Russia's maybe concerning but a known. China's concerning but less known. And so there's consequently more interest in diversifying. So in just a few remaining moments, to compare a bit to South Asia, I am not an expert in South Asia. You'll have two experts in South Asia following me, so I will just be very brief and look at how China views this region strategically. I think because of China's tensions with India, South Asia is viewed differently than Central Asia. And China also has a close partnership with Pakistan and is concerned about having access to the Indian Ocean and the Malacca Strait. And so has been focusing on port development as a consequence of that. In terms of similarities, there's Pakistan's border with Xinjiang and the similar concern about spillover of instability. And if you look overall of where China's BRI invests, you see Pakistan as one of the top ones, Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka. So there's there's some overlap in terms of regional focus there. Russia also plays a role in South Asia, coordinating in some respects. For example, Russia has been increasing its interactions with Pakistan, but Russia is a close partner of India, so that creates a different dynamic than you have with China and Central Asia. For China, instability in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka creates some opportunity, perhaps, but also some concern about the security of investments. And the region, just like Central Asia, has a lot of variety in terms of the level of development, the nature of the countries, and so on. But I would say that there are some significant differences with Central Asia, especially because of the role of India as a major power and the heightened role of maritime security in this particular region. And of course, the issue of Afghanistan, which globalizes the region, and also it straddles Central Asia and South Asia, so that introduces some new dynamics. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And again, you gave an excellent entree to, as you said, we're going to move to our two South Asia experts. I'm going to turn first to Michael and ask you, kind of actually, again, Elizabeth gave an excellent setup, but how have Pakistan and India responded to changing dynamics in Central Asia? And building on that, and actually circling back to a point Marcia mentioned when she talked about new institutions, do you think there are any regional platforms that have contributed or could contribute to partnerships between a changing Central Asia and South Asia?
Well, thanks, Jennifer. And I'd like to say first off, on behalf of the South Asia Institute, how excited that we are about this new series on the geopolitics of Eurasia. And I want to commend you and our new global fellow, Rahula, who you all hear from soon, for the excellent efforts on this new initiative. So yeah, in terms of India and Pakistan, these two countries, rivals though they are, I'd argue that they share a few interests and objectives when it comes to Central Asia. Both are keen to engage more with the region for commercial and especially potentially energy-related reasons. Central Asia's gas reserves are important for two countries that depend heavily on natural gas for, among other things, transport fuel, and which cannot fully address demand through indigenous resources or imports from the Middle East. India and Pakistan also see the Central Asian states as like-minded partners on issues related to Afghanistan, especially shared concerns about terrorism and specifically ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province. The leverage that Central Asian states arguably wield over Afghanistan due to Afghanistan's heavy dependence on electricity imports from Central Asia is attractive to New Delhi and Islamabad as well. I mean, they could in principle derive advantages from deepening ties with a region that has that type of influence, that type of pull over a country, Afghanistan, with security risks that are concerning for both India and Pakistan. I would, however, make one more comment about India-Pakistan convergences in Central Asia that is, I think, notable in light of this broader question of how the war in Ukraine is impacting Eurasian geopolitics. India and Pakistan are both okay with the idea of Russian influence in Central Asia, and that's because, as we heard before, and as we all know, India has a special relationship with Russia, going back to the Cold War era treaty of friendship with the Soviets, and Pakistan is quietly, cautiously trying to build up ties with Russia. Last year, it started importing Russian oil for the first time. So India and Pakistan, while they would not feel strongly against Central Asian states trying to rely less on Moscow, would certainly be fine with continued Russian influence in Central Asia. I would argue, however, that not surprisingly, India and Pakistan in many ways look at Central Asia in very different ways. So first, a few comments on Pakistan. For Islamabad, Central Asia figures quite prominently in Pakistani plans, and I emphasize the word plans, not policies or actions, plans to reframe its foreign policy through what officials in Pakistan describe as geoeconomics rather than geopolitics. In other words, Pakistan wants its foreign policy to focus more around generating more trade and connectivity. This entails not partnering with more within its own region, South Asia, where it has few close partnerships, where it confronts the India challenge, and where there's not much region-wide integration on the whole. I'm talking about South Asia. Instead, Pakistan wants to focus this geoeconomics project, this notional project, on Afghanistan and Central Asia. And Central Asia has geopolitical advantages for Pakistan. I mean, the two main external powers, so to speak, there are countries with which Pakistan has good ties, Russia and especially China, which is a close Pakistani ally. The main initial focus of this envisioned Central Asia tilt for Pakistan is a potential transnational rail project involving Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. And incidentally, this is a project that's very interesting. It's a project that the US government previously backed. So, I mean, some of you may remember very soon before the Taliban retook power, this was back in July 2021, a new Quad was announced, and it consisted of the US, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan. And its goal was to cooperate on promoting regional connectivity involving those countries. But the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan just a few weeks later essentially torpedoed that Quad. Now, this rail project has its challenges for sure, in terms of financing, in terms of security risks in Afghanistan, and also in terms of tensions that Pakistan has had with the Taliban since the Taliban returned to power. Though it is worth noting that the Taliban has long stated its support for transboundary connectivity projects, including older ones like, the much ballyhooed TAPI pipeline, which the Taliban continues to talk up. A few comments on India now. Its objectives for wanting to deepen engagement with Central Asia, in addition to those that I mentioned before that are in line with Pakistan's, include the following. Taking steps to strengthen its clout and influence. This is a country with major power aspirations. India also wants to counter China, part of a strategic competition in play for some time. And linked to that, India is also motivated by a desire to strengthen its outreach to the global South. One of its top foreign policy goals over the last year or so has been to project itself as an advocate and champion of the global South to counter Beijing's own efforts to do so. India does face some considerable disadvantages with its Central Asia outreach. Most critically, it lacks access to the most direct land route to Central Asia from India via Pakistan and Afghanistan, because Pakistan tends to deny transit trade rights to India. And additionally, China's influence in Central Asia is a challenge for India due to their competition. India has sought several workarounds. In recent years, the government there has hosted high-level summits meant to bring senior Central Asian leaders to India for talks, and the most prominent one is the India Central Asia Summit, which has had several iterations. The goal here is for New Delhi to strengthen its engagement with Central Asia. The Chabahar Port Project, which I think Dr. McGraw mentioned, this is another envisioned workaround for India. It wants to work with Iran to develop the port there in Chabahar and then build up trade routes to and from Central Asia via Afghanistan. Now, the US government had previously exempted India from any sanctions for these activities with Iran, though in recent months, perhaps as the US-Iran relationship has continued to deteriorate, the Biden administration has suggested that future sanctions cannot entirely be ruled out. One thing India does have going in its favor with the Chabahar Afghanistan Central Asia project is that, contrary to the expectations of many analysts, India's relations with the Taliban, since that group's return to power, have been fairly cordial and workable, though not formal. India has reopened its embassy in Kabul. It did that some time ago. This makes it easier to engage with Afghanistan on connectivity-related issues. And I'd also note that Central Asia has its own compelling reasons to want to engage more with India and Pakistan, I would think. It can help gain access to, or facilitate access to warm water ports in India and Pakistan for trade. Stronger commercial ties with India and Pakistan could, in principle, enable the region to reduce economic reliance on Russia and China over time, though that's a big if, given that the challenges of expanding commercial ties with both Pakistan, given Pakistan's severe economic woes, and India, given India's geographic location and the challenges that can pose. So I'll conclude very briefly on a note on your second question about possible regional platforms to leverage. There are two main regional forums that come to mind that comprise both South and Central Asian states, though I'd argue that at least for the moment, neither of them can really escape the shadow of Russia and China. So the first one is SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's traditionally been focused on security issues, much of this focused on Afghanistan. Like BRICS, it projects itself as an alternative to Western models, but it hasn't really produced many meaningful substantive initiatives in that regard. But it is an effective organization, and it has high-level leaders summits and other high-level meetings every year. India and Pakistan are members, as are, of course, a number of Central Asian states, but it has tended to be dominated by Russia and China. Its membership is slowly expanding, not as much as we've seen with BRICS. If these expansions continue, perhaps in time that could dilute the influence of Russia and China, but that would be a long-term prospect. And the other regional forum constituting South and Central Asian states that comes to mind is the Heart of Asia Istanbul process. But the problem here is this is essentially an initiative co-led by Afghanistan and Turkey, and with the Taliban now back in power in Afghanistan, it hasn't really done much in recent years because, among other things, its members are a bit uncomfortable engaging with a regime, the Taliban, that their governments don't recognize. All this said, to try to end on an optimistic note, there might be possibilities for reframing the priorities of these South Central Asia regional groups so that they can focus on issues of common concern for all members in South and Central Asia. One of these could be climate change. Another could be terrorism and the threat that ISKP poses not just in Afghanistan, but in many surrounding states, including members of SCO and Heart of Asia. And perhaps there could be some scope for engagement from the Trump administration in these forums on these collaborative efforts focused on countering ISKP. So I'll end there.
No, thank you so much, Michael, for incredibly comprehensive remarks there. Before I turn to Rahula, I just want to remind our audience members, after I ask Rahula a couple questions, we're going to open it up to the audience to ask their own questions. So again, you have two ways to submit your questions. One is you can email the Kennan Institute to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. And the other is you can use the question and answer button at the base of your Zoom screen and submit a question that way. So again, I encourage audience members, again, you've had 3 comprehensive accounts here, to send in your questions and ask Rahula a couple questions and then open it up to the audience. So Rahula, building on actually what all 3 of our previous guests have said, mentioning some of these other players in the region, right? Other regional powers that some get mentioned to differing degrees. And my first question for you is, how specifically have Turkey and Iran responded positively, negatively, or otherwise to the changing relations between Central Asia and South Asia? So that's my main question. Then kind of a follow-on I want to ask you before we do open up to the audience is, what should Central Asia and South Asia watchers be paying attention to in the coming years that maybe they're missing, right? That those tend to be focused on one lens and they should be focused on another lens.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be with a distinguished speaker here, and thanks to you and Michael for partnering on this series of events and discussion we'll have on this critical topic and this important region. Turkey and Iran, like many other regional players, have been playing a critical role in Central Asia and Caucasus, during different historical time frame. Although both Iran and Turkey do not see Central Asia Caucasus as a top primary foreign policy topic, but as a secondary topic, still they have had active engagement in that region. So in terms of Turkey specifically, Turkey's engagement with Central Asia has gone significant transformation since the post-Soviet collapse in the 90s, initially fueled by the notions of pan-Turkic unity. Turkey envisioned itself as a unifying force among newly independent Turkic states of the Caucasus and Central Asia. However, these ambitions were later tempered by some practical limitations and challenges, including the challenge of economic instability, the insurgency, PKK, as well as the political strife, which led to a more pragmatic approach by Turkey. But later, a decade later, Turkey shifted its focus toward Europe and Middle East. And the current President Erdogan, became deeply preoccupied with conflict in Syria and broader Middle East strategy, which again did not put Central Asia in a top priority topic for Turkey. However, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine and during this time, Turkey has adopted a nationalist realignment, renewing Turkey's interest in Central Asia and Caucasus, as we see these days. So Turkey's current strategy in broader Eurasia is largely driven by economic opportunities and infrastructure development, as or some other players like China. For example, Middle Corridor initiatives, which links China, Central Asia, and Caucasus and Turkey to Europe. Turkey is engaged in investing heavily in the railway, logistic hubs, and connectivity projects, among others, but also culturally through soft power initiatives like education program, media. Turkey continues to strengthen cultural balance in that region. In terms of the geopolitical context and also managing rivalry and partnership, Turkey's relationship with Central Asia exists within the competitive political landscape dominated by Russia, China, Iran, and India, which was mentioned by Michael. With Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine, as discussed, the war has disrupted tradition, trade, and energy route, increasing the geopolitical significance of the Central Asia. So therefore, Turkey sees this as an opportunity to bolster its role, providing alternative route to Russia's dominated infrastructure. That's one. And then Iran as a rival as well as a partner, bringing Iran into discussion, both seek to expand influence in Central Asia, but their approach in some places diverge. With Iran's emphasized shared cultural heritage and position itself as a counter-terrorism ally, which was also discussed earlier, with Afghanistan being an area of concern for all of them, Turkey focuses on leveraging its pan-Turkic connections and economic potential in the region. I don't want to talk about China's BRIs, but that remains a significant focus in the region. Despite Turkey's, of course, these ambitious plans, Turkey faces some hurdles. I mean, in solidifying its role in Eurasia, for example, why Azerbaijan remains a strong ally for Turkey. Tension in the region and Turkey's competition with Russia limits its maneuverability in there. And also, Turkey is trying to balance its NATO commitment and with pursuit of deeper ties with Russia and China. A challenge that requires careful diplomacy, and Turkey is trying to adapt that sort of mediator role rather than parting with one versus others. In terms of Iran's role historically, again similar to Turkey, Iran itself views itself as a Central Asia's natural partner, citing a shared culture, history, and heritage, as well as direct land border with Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, which provide Central Asian states with their most immediate access to international water. Chabahar Port was mentioned earlier. The Western sanction on Russia, particularly following the invasion of Ukraine, prompted Central Asian countries to seek alternative trade routes, shifting away from their traditional reliance, again, like Turkey, in engagement. Iran also providing a network of route and export for Central Asian countries. Iran emerges as a key partner in this effort, as also proved by the frequent visit of Central Asian leaders like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan to Tehran between 2022 through 2023, including now that continues. Iran's role, again, in facilitating East-West trade corridor gained prominence with tests run freight trains connecting Central Asia and Turkey through Iran, highlighting its strategic importance, linking China and the European Union through this multimodal routes. These development, of course, underscored Iran's global involvement in reshaping regional trade dynamics and geopolitical shifts. That is in addition to Iran's engagement with Afghanistan, China and Russia building a more strategic security coalition for its interest and regional interest, which is again a threat for Western engagement. In terms of beyond economic, Iran's last point in terms of regional engagement, Iran has also sought to position itself as a reliable partner in counterterrorism and regional security. The integration of drone production facility in Tajikistan highlights Iran's willingness to engage in military and security operation in that region. Again, it's because of the concern both countries have from the militancy in Afghanistan and the Pakistan border that encourage those initiatives. Finally, I mean, Iran's engagement with Central Asia, as discussed also earlier, serves to mitigate the impact of Western sanctions. By fostering closer ties with the northern neighbors, Iran hopes to create a new economic lifeline, reduce its international isolation, and establish itself as a key node in the trade route, like the North-South corridor and China-Belt and Road Initiative that was discussed. I don't want to, maybe I will go into the deeper discussion during Q&A about Afghanistan's role in Iran and the entire region, which by itself requires a long hours to discuss, but I'm open to talk about it during the Q&A. Finally, in terms of what to look, your second question in terms of the region, during my most recent visits and discussion in the Caucasus, going to the border with Russia in Georgia, talking to Moldova and other countries, it seems that those countries have developed some hope for diversification, but they still have their concern over Russia's aggressive invasion, which happened in Georgia in 2008. So there is that concern. Turkey remains a strong partner for Caucasus, especially Georgia in terms of trade and dependency for other strategic relationship, and also for Azerbaijan. The China-Iran-Russia network in Afghanistan is another thing to watch in the coming years. Iran's growing influence in Afghanistan in partnership with China, Russia reflects their shared goals, establishing regional security network, as I mentioned. Also, China's expanding role in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, you might have seen that China increased investment and engagement, operationalizing and investing in Wakhan corridor, connecting China's Xinjiang province to Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, connecting this missing link in BRI that complete that region's circle. So that's not only a strategic, economic, but also in terms of security. China wants to increase its footprints and work in this aspect. It works also with Iran, connecting Iran's in those efforts. There is a positive trends that of course we'll have to watch. The Central Asian countries are opening up. Uzbekistan is strongly pushing for foreign investment, for private sector investment, for Americans companies to invest there. Kazakhstan, among others. So there are a lot of opportunities for new administration in terms of private sector investment, energy sector, rail, mineral that was mentioned. And also in terms of potential growth market for Central Asians export to Middle East and other markets that they are investing in different routes. For example, the railway connecting Uzbekistan to Pakistan, which was mentioned, and also the Chaban report, among others. So I will stop there in the interest of time, but I will be happy to answer any other questions during Q&A about other areas I missed. So over to you, Jennifer, and thank you again.
No, thank you so much, Rahula. I have noted down so many notes from everyone's talks here. I am going to, though, turn it over, save some of my questions, but turn it over to our audience members. The first question I'm going to take, and again, to our audience members, please do feel free to submit your questions by that Q&A function on Zoom, or you can send them by email to the Kennan Institute. The first question I'm going to ask from David Silverman, and this is probably directed at Marcia and Elizabeth, but anyone should feel free to take it. How have Central Asian states responded collectively or individually to international concerns about China's policies of oppression, neocolonialism, and genocide toward the Uyghur ethnic group, which of course exists in modern-day Xinjiang, accounting for approximately 55% of the province's population, but also in multiple Central Asian states?
Perhaps Elizabeth could start because she has to leave early.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's an interesting question, and I can tell you from my recent experience in Kazakhstan, there's a different way that this country deals with the Xinjiang issue than we see in the EU or the US. So the focus in Kazakhstan is on the Kazakhs who are caught up in this network of camps in Xinjiang. And there's a policy to resettle Kazakhs from Xinjiang to Kazakhstan, especially younger Kazakhs. And so it's a lot of quiet diplomacy, although there are some protesters in front of the Chinese consulate in Almaty about the issue. So I think there's a kind of effort to create a balance between creating the trade and investment ties that the government wants to develop and to safeguard the interests of co-ethnics in China. So it's not you don't see this issue in the Arab world or in many countries where you would expect to have strong responses. You don't see that because their economic issues do tend to override them in the approach to China. And so you do see that in Central Asia as well. Although I think under this, beneath the surface, there are other efforts underway to deal with co-ethnics.
I would just underscore that point. It's quiet diplomacy. It doesn't mean there's no concern because there are ties, family ties, and long historical ties in this region. Remember during the Cold War, this whole era was frozen, frankly. I mean, the relations go back a very long time. So it doesn't mean that they've ended those cultural links. It just means that the conversation is handled differently than we would in the West.
Excellent. Thank you both. The next question I'm going to take comes from Daniel Todoro, who asks, is India's direct outreach to Central Asia not appreciated as pro-Russian and anti-Chinese?
Happy to address that first if you'd like. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And, India's outreach to Central Asia is, I think, driven in part by great power competition considerations. I mentioned that before, that it's competition with China driving to an extent its envisioned engagement with Central Asia. But I wouldn't overstate that. India does cooperate with China on many levels, commercially quite broadly. And even when they've had border clashes and really tense relations, they've continued to trade, including over the last few years. But also, you see this India-China competition specifically in terms of multilateral collaborations with Central Asia. So, India works with China in the SCO and in the Heart of Asia groupings. I think that maybe the best geopolitical rivalry lens to apply, so to speak, to India's outreach to Central Asia would be Pakistan. India knows that Pakistan is working hard to try to link up more with Central Asia through various initiatives, including that transnational rail initiative I mentioned with Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. And so I think that's a country that India is I think thinking about as it pursues these engagements with the region.
Also, just to add to Michael's point, India has some limitation versus China in terms of how they connect with Central Asian countries, and there is no direct link between India and Central Asia. They do try to connect through Chabahar port with Afghanistan for a long time, but it has been impacted by the sanctions and infrastructure. India has invested to build the ring road in Afghanistan for that purpose, to connect with Central Asia, and China and India in some infrastructure projects there also collaborate. I think there is for India to compete with China, India has some challenges, and I don't think that's something that India is looking at this stage, because there is huge potential for both countries to open to connect with Central Asian countries for export and other strategic connectivity.
I'd just like to add that I don't think the Central Asian countries are acting in an anti-China way. I think they have their issues with China, and it mostly has to do with China's policies in their countries. But when they try to reach out to other countries, it's to diversify their options. So I think they want to work with China generally, but they're looking for additional options, and India is one of them. So I'm sorry, I have to leave now. So it was great being a part of this discussion.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Marcia, did you have any comments you wanted to add on to this question before?
Just to note that I don't think the United States even can replace China or Russia in the economic sphere, but it can give alternatives. And it can also provide institutional mechanisms, not provide, but facilitate institutional mechanisms among these parties. Because as you said initially, and as Elizabeth said, there is a tendency of these large countries to deal individually with the smaller countries in the region. And to their benefit, they would try to combine some interests in very practical ways. And I mentioned the electricity market. This might also include a Pakistan because of the links earlier that were envisioned with the hydroelectricity projects down to Pakistan, but also because of recent concerns in Pakistan about the high cost of electricity due to Chinese investments. So in other words, there could be a dialogue started that goes across Central Asia to Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'd be actually interested to hear if that would resonate as well with the other speakers.
Yeah, Rahul or Michael, do you want to? Yeah, Michael.
Well, yeah, very briefly, yes. I mean, in principle, yeah. As I said before, Pakistan is really trying to prioritize deepening its commercial ties with Afghanistan in that regard. But I would argue that Pakistan is severely constrained by a number of factors in this regard. One is its own. Well, it has a variety of structural economic constraints that it's dealing with on an everyday basis, particularly now. And I think that limits the prospects for it to fulfill this vision of this more geoeconomics focused foreign policy along the lines of what you had referred to before. But yeah, in principle, I think that it would make some sense.
There are some regional efforts and projects that can promote that, but there are geopolitical security and competition block that. For example, Tapi gas line and gas pipeline is another example of how gas coming from Turkmenistan all the way from Afghanistan to India. That create a partnership between all countries that the pipeline is going. But again, it's there are other priorities, strategic security and economics that hasn't allowed those partnerships to move forward as desired.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next question I'm going to take is from Ann Phillips. It says, it appears that the key actors, China, Iran, Turkey, and India, are more comfortable with diversified economic political partners rather than seeking exclusive alignments? If correct, does this give them an advantage over the US, which still seems to view relations in binary terms? So I think anyone should feel free to jump in.
Well, let me start. Yeah, so countries like Turkey, Iran, and many other interested parties in that region, they have a more interest-based relationship with Central Asian countries. It's mostly bilateral. And their bilateral relationship is based on their particular security and economics. For example, in case of Iran, Iran's relationship with Tajikistan is more security and counterterrorism. Its relationship with Uzbekistan and other part with Turkmenistan is more energy based. But Turkey's relationship with most of Central Asia countries is based on the trade and transit, while there is a limited relationship with Iran. I'm sorry, excuse me, with Tajikistan. And Armenia. So I think there's no unified coalition or efforts by countries to oppose a Western approach, but slowly, as we see Iran with lack of U.S. presence in the region, with the Afghanistan's U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the environment is now enabled for such coalition to build, which make it harder for the West in the long term to have a more beneficial strategic interest, with China, Russia, and Iran building a strategic partnership around Afghanistan on the security and strategic, and also China connecting its more economic BRI through Afghanistan, investing more. So I think that will have a future concern for countries in the West to think about.
And if I can very briefly just add on to that in responding to the India component of the question, and here I'll amplify what I had said earlier and what Rahula said earlier as well. I mean, the geography factor is a major disadvantage for India in this regard. I mean, indeed, it is looking to Chabahar as a workaround to its lack of direct access to the region, but we can't rule out, well, at the very least, India moving forward, I think, will worry about the possibility of sanctions, even though it's unlikely. From the U.S., given its commitment to engaging commercially with Iran on the port, and the idea of trying to build connectivity pathways up into Central Asia through Iran via Afghanistan, that's freighted with challenges. I mean, we don't need to go through those. So it wouldn't be easy for India, but India it's emphasizing the diplomatic engagement now. As I had said before, it very frequently hosts top leaders from the region, from Central Asia, in New Delhi as part of the India Central Asia Summit and related things like that. It's trying to make progress on that front. But I think in terms of concrete initiatives that could lead to actual connectivity projects that enable it to access Central Asia, it's a long way from getting to that point.
Marcia, did you want to add in anything else?
I think that there's been a lot of effort in institutions like the World Bank to build on those opportunities, and they have been challenging. There's no question about that. It also is the trade basket. What do countries have that they want to buy and sell? And a lot of the countries in the region are then looking more to the West, looking more to Europe. And Uzbekistan, for example, has now 300 products that it exports to Europe. There's a lot more trade within Central Asia, which I think is positive. So it would be a great opportunity for Central Asians to trade with this commercial juggernaut of India, a developing country. But I agree that geographic issues are the impediment at the moment, in addition to other trade-related soft issues.
Excellent. Next question I wanted to take says, what's the panel's view on the middle power concept Kazakhstan has been promoting as of late? What role can Kazakhstan play in these changing geopolitical dynamics? And maybe just since I realize we're coming up on time here, maybe expand that question for any of you then to say, going back to this idea of like, are there certain platforms or are there certain proposals out there? Any of the regions you guys are specialists in, do you see any certain like proposals out there that seem to be gaining traction, whether from Kazakhstan, whether the Middle Quarter and in the South Caucasus, or other things that were talked about with respect to Pakistan and India?
I would just go back to my first point, and I think that middle powers have to use their agency for greater impact. One of the problems all middle income countries have is to rise to an upper income status. And the best way they can do that is through greater trade integration, which means policies that enable them to trade more efficiently with their neighbors. And so to the extent that Kazakhstan can take a lead, Uzbekistan in the region, they are doing already, very notable efforts that they're taking in signing railroad and transit deals with Azerbaijan and Georgia, for example. This is the kind of carving out of a predominant new role for the regional economy that they can and should take the lead in. And eventually, when the Ukraine war winds up, we hope, and there's reconstruction in Ukraine, those countries are well positioned to then move through this new middle corridor across the Black Sea and try to expand their footprint in the region. So more power to them, let them use their agency, let them connect with their neighbors and grow.
Just to add to Marsha's point, yes, as mentioned, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, they are now leading these efforts, but there are a few important things that I think they are trying to work, and where now U.S. will be able to play a role with a more private sector-led approach to that region, and that's from those countries' point of view, how they attract private sector investment, how U.S. can support to help them build the enabling environment. During the first Trump administration, the USDFC played a critical role in building that environment and attracting businesses and private sector. And then Central Asian countries, mostly Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, among others, responded positively by introducing a lot of reforms and changes in their legal framework and in their capacity building, so the private sector and U.S. companies can go and invest and work. And we hope that same thing would continue in terms of U.S. position, and there will be a strong partnership and transaction between the West and especially U.S. led with that region, with the regional countries taking the lead on their efforts, and then countries like the U.S. facilitate and support and bring more investment power there.
And I would just very briefly say on this theme of looking to what could be coming next, much of our South Asia focused discussion is revolved around three countries: India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. But let's remember the other countries of South Asia too. And one of the big geopolitical stories in South Asia over the last year or so is a number of leadership transitions, a lot of leadership changes that have brought to power a number of leaders that are inclined to want to work more closely with China. We've seen this in Bangladesh, we've seen it in Nepal, we've seen it in Sri Lanka, several other places as well. And so what that might mean for these countries' thoughts about contemplating more engagement with Central Asia, a region where China has significant levels of influence, that's something to think of. These countries that I mentioned, the non-India, Pakistan, Afghanistan countries of South Asia, they don't have extensive ties and relations with Central Asia. But I think it's important that we keep the wider region in mind in this story too.
No, and I think that is a very important point. We tend to assume abstractly that certain powers are able to determine what goes on, and then there are a huge number of people, huge number of cultures, huge number of languages that we're talking about in this region. So we are unfortunately at time. I know we still have some, and as I'm reading them, excellent questions that have come in from our audience members, but I want to thank our four guests, Marsha McGraw-Olive, Elizabeth Wishnick, Michael Kugelman, Rahul Osmani, for an excellent discussion. And as was mentioned by Michael, this is the beginning of an initiative between the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and South Asia Institute to do a series of discussions focusing on these connections between the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and South Asia. So even though we didn't get to everyone's questions today, please do look for our next events. And again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
This video was produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. If you'd like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. There you'll find in-depth discussions and research on important global issues and topics. And thanks for watching.